Hi, everyone. My name is Carson Weitnauer, and I serve as the Executive Director for Uncommon Pursuit. And today we are talking about a fascinating topic. It is the surprising reasons that skeptics start to follow Jesus. And our featured expert for today is Dr. Jana Harmon, who did her PhD research on this exact topic. So, Jana, I am so thankful you've joined us today. I would love for you to introduce yourself to everyone, share a bit about your background, and why this topic is so close to your heart.
Thank you again, Carson, for having me. A little bit about my background. I am from the U.S., obviously born and raised in the Midwest in Oklahoma, and came to Atlanta, Georgia in 1993. So that's my home, the southern U.S. But I became interested in this whole idea of skeptics coming to Jesus. It started really around 2004 when I just became interested in the idea of truth and Christian worldview, because at the time, my husband and I were leading a small group in our church. It was for seekers and skeptics. And they would come and we would try the best we could to show them Jesus and teach them the Bible. And they would ask good questions. And I had not had much exposure outside the Christian worldview. And so I was left flat-footed on many occasions, really ignorant, to be honest. I had no idea the grounding of the Christian worldview beyond what I knew. I wasn't familiar with other worldviews and how to answer these questions meaningfully, substantively. And I didn't want to embarrass myself or Jesus or the church. And so around that time, I began a master's program at Biola University in Christian apologetics, because I wanted to know the big answers to the big questions. And I wanted to understand the grounding of the Christian worldview. And I spent 3.5 years doing that. And after I got out, I had a lot of my questions answered, and I had a lot of confidence in the Christian worldview that it was true and that it matched with reality, and that we had substance and evidence and arguments that were really, really good. But over time, as I watched atheists and Christians continue to debate and write, there seemed to be very little impasse. Very little agreement, I guess you could say.
Right.
There was a lot of impasse, not a lot of agreement. And I thought, well, if the arguments are so convincing for me and the evidence is so compelling, why don't atheists believe? There seemed to be something going on about that. Of course, at the time, too, I was trying to really appreciate who the skeptic was. I was reading Francis Schaeffer because, of course, he had a wonderful ministry in Switzerland where non-believers would come and they would talk about philosophy and art and Christian worldview and other worldviews. And I was reading Blaise Pascal and listening to him talk about how sometimes our beliefs are formed for more than what is true. It's formed for what we find attractive. And so I started thinking about, we may hold beliefs for more than rational reasons. Of course, coming out of an apologetics program, you think the rational is the most convincing, but sometimes we're not driven by our own rationality. So I wanted to take a step back and see what it would take for an atheist to become a Christian. Is it something rational? Is it something different? Is it something more than that? And I wanted to see, what did it take? And so I wanted to take a closer look at that. And that's when I re-engaged in academia. And I started at the University of Birmingham in England in 2013 and investigated that for about 6 years. I graduated in 2019 to take a closer look at 50 former atheists, to look at why they embraced atheism, what turned them to a more openness towards another perspective, and what brought them on to Christ in their life since.
That is a really compelling story, Jana. And I have not done a PhD on this topic, but I can confess that when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, as they say. And
Yes.
I've always been interested in apologetics. And I have to acknowledge that that blinded me to noticing a lot of other things happening in my heart and in the hearts of the people around me, students and friends and family. And because I was so attuned to the rational side of human nature, I was often unable to see the full dimension of the person in front of me, or even who I was and how I was engaging with them at a heart level. And so I'm curious to hear more about what you have to share today, because as valuable as the rational component of our lives are, clearly there's a lot more going on. And so that's one thing we've both had to unlearn. I'm curious, as you've gone from where you were 20 years ago to where you are today, having done all this research and, hosting the Side B podcast and doing all these interviews, what are some of the major areas you've had to unlearn about why skeptics start to follow Jesus?
Well, there's a lot of things that I had to unlearn just even thinking about it, just like you were talking about. There's such a presumption that we have in our perspective on who we are and who others are, that I think one of the first things that I had to unlearn was the fact that God is, I didn't think that God was not a big God. God is amazing. He is omnipotent. He's all powerful and all good and all of those things. But for some reason in my mind, you think, oh, they would never come to Christ. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
he would never think about it. Oh, she, just forget her. She's kind of a lost cause. And you would probably never say that out loud, or I wouldn't. But in your mind, you think, oh, maybe someone closer to the kingdom, is worth investing. But what I learned, what I had to unlearn, is really my own limitations on God and my own limitations on other people to come to a place of seeing God in a fresh and new way. When I entered into my program and I wanted to take this on to find former atheists, I didn't know any former atheists. I thought, are they even out there besides the handful of those who had written books, the famous apologists that we know now? But the Lord quickly showed me that, he said, oh, you want to see that there are former atheists that I've changed their mind and their heart and their lives here. Put your net on this side of the boat and I will fill it up to overflowing. And that's what he did. And that's what he continues to do, is to bring people across my path who were once very, very far away from the Lord, whom he has brought not only close, but are compelling ambassadors for Christ. I think that's one thing that I had to unlearn in terms of my own bias. You were saying that there are a lot of different reasons for belief, a lot of different reasons for disbelief. And I think that's another thing I had to unlearn was we read books or an article, or we hear a person speak and they have this theory about why group X believes this, or group Y doesn't believe that. And it's because of this one big reason. It's kind of like you and I thought, it was on the rational. But like some people will say, oh, atheists are atheists just because, and then fill in the blank. Oh, they had a bad father, or they just want to live an immoral life, or, again, just take a guess. And so, but the thing is what I've come to appreciate is that, as you were saying, we are complex people and we are whole persons. And just because something is motivating for one person doesn't mean it's motivating for another. And the reason why some person holds a particular belief may be completely different from the reason another person does. And you cannot broad brush everyone and pigeonhole people into one perspective. And I think I was guilty of that, certainly. And I think a lot of people are guilty of the way they view Christians or the way we view, atheists or skeptics or whatever. And so I had to unlearn these presumptions. And you do that by taking each individual and each story personally and uniquely, because we are all uniquely made by God. We all have unique experiences and perspectives and emotional personalities and, things that we've learned and things that our culture has taught us. There's so many things that you put in that mix that motivate our beliefs. You can't just broad brush with one particular thing. Although I will say there are certain things that are so compelling that push someone towards non-belief or whatever, like a tragic experience. But then it becomes enwrapped in a lot of other things. Those are a few things that I've unlearned. And again, taking someone as a whole person. And also, I think I would lastly say that we think that God has to reach someone through a particular way. And one thing that I've learned through this experience and interviewing all of these different people is God is a personal God, and He loves and sees everyone individually, and He can meet people in extremely personal and powerful ways. And I have just gotten so much hope and encouragement from seeing these stories, and I hope that whoever's listening finds some hope too, whether they think someone is too far away, they would never believe, but God reaches everyone who is seeking in very personal and powerful ways.
Jana, I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but I guess my observation of your heart in that is a process of going from more pride to more humility, of thinking, I know that this person, God wouldn't reach them. I know this person's reason will be this. I know that this person needs this. And going away from that posture to, God, I don't know who you want to save. You're a big God, and I'm going to pray and throw the seed out on the path and see what you want to do, God. I'm open to your amazing work. And that humility before another person. I don't know your story. I don't know your heart. I may not know my own heart. And so I'm here to be available to you. And I think the more we can get God's help to embrace that humble posture of saying, I don't know what God's up to. I don't know what's going on in your life. That in itself seems like part of the transition that you've made in your own journey.
I would say you're spot on with that, Carson. And I would reemphasize what you just said there in terms of conversion, moving from one worldview to another, particularly from, atheism to Christianity or disbelief to belief. It is an act of God. It is orchestrated by God. God draws people to Himself. He helps them along the journey. We are just little participants in the Lord's grander action. So it is something that, as with all of our Christian life, everything that we do, we should be completely dependent upon Him, listening, learning, perceiving, discerning, stepping in, speaking, all of those things. They're all from the Holy Spirit. So yes, it is definitely humbling. Everything is a humbling experience for sure.
Now, Jana, at the same time, there is a way to move forward with keener observation, more wisdom about the shape of people's stories. And my understanding of your research is you found 4 significant categories that are worth looking out for in people's lives. One of them is when a skeptic encounters a disruptive witness. Another is when they begin to experience some disruptive longings. Another is when a disruptive crisis comes into their life. And the fourth category I've heard you mention is a disruptive circumstance, something that's not a crisis, but a change in their environment prompts them to reconsider Jesus or to consider Jesus for the first time. So those are four very intriguing categories. How do you define those categories? Help us understand what's behind that language.
When I was looking at the process of how and why someone develops atheistic beliefs, I was impressed with the strength and the resistance of those beliefs, the reticence towards believing anything else. Nearly 2/3 of them said it didn't matter what evidence or arguments or anything you put in their face or present to them, they would not move from their atheism. So the catalyst is that moment or period of time in which someone moves from a closed to a more open position or posturing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are seeking after the Judeo-Christian God. That means that they're willing to consider another perspective in a more intentional and active way. And sometimes it's actually trying to move to disprove or discredit. So just because someone has a catalyst towards movement doesn't necessarily mean that their intention is to move towards God, Jesus, and Christianity, although somehow most all of them, at least in my study, ended up moving in that direction. So if you think of a catalyst like a catalytic converter on an engine, and I'm no mechanic by any means, but the catalyst is that spark, that where the spark helps the catalytic converter move from a dead, the engine is off, and then that spark it's catalytic towards turning the engine on. And that's what this is. It is an initial spark, if you will. It's not conversion. It may even not be questing in any kind of real or intentional way. What it helps do is it's the door opener, is a good way to say it. It's the beginning of the process of conversion. So I just kind of want to make that clear, because what starts someone, excuse me, on the path towards Jesus is not. It's just the beginning of the path. Whereas, like, for example, if we say that the rationality doesn't always count at the beginning, it usually comes into the picture when it comes towards closer to belief. Okay. So they wouldn't believe it unless they believed it was true. And that's important to say. But at the very beginning, what turns their head, their mind, their heart towards even looking at it may not have anything to do with the rational at all. So, for example, the first disruptive witness. A disruptive witness is when you're going along, someone is going along, they're not looking for God, they have no interest in God, they may even hate the things of God, but they have developed very strong precepts or presumptions about who God is, who Christians are, what Christianity is, what the Bible is, and they're mostly negative. They have caricatures and negative stereotypes in their mind. And so when someone actually comes along, a witness, a person, and disrupts their categories, it causes them to kind of sit back and go, okay, this isn't what I thought. Maybe God isn't who I thought, or maybe Christians aren't who I thought. I think one of the big problems, and we see it culturally today, is there's usually a huge social separation between skeptics and Christians. So there's half of the people that I interviewed had no exposure to religion at all, except for what they received from the culture. And usually that's not a very pretty picture. I watched a movie.
Kind of pop media that gives you a beautiful presentation of the surprising love and goodness of Christians. That is something that maybe an expert could pinpoint for me, but it's hard to think of the examples that would describe that.
Yes, yes. My husband and I 2 nights ago watched a film that was Academy Award nominated and received Academy Awards in 2007. We thought maybe this is something we can watch, and it painted the most perverse picture of the pastor who was just looked crazy and out of his mind and doing very disturbing things. And you think, okay, that's all right. So that, that was a moment in time, just where when people don't have any kind of personal engagement with Christians and all they see is what's presented to them from culture, what they see on social media. And so it can be very disrupting when they actually meet someone who counters their perspective. I'll give you an example. And that the countering of the perspective could be like someone who's intelligent. One of the most remarkable findings in my study is when I asked the former atheists what they thought of Christians as atheists, and they had several things that they could check off. One of them was educated. Not one person thought Christians were educated people. So here's an example of a story that someone was just completely floored by meeting a person who was actually halfway intelligent. And it started his journey. His name is Davin, and he was a brilliant young man. He was the captain of his debate club. He had a father who was an intellectual scientist. He always liked being the smartest guy in the room. He read The Existential Atheist and declared himself a nihilist by the time he was 14. About 2 or 3 years later, he went to a writer's club. He met a young lady who was there and ended up meeting her father. He was completely taken aback, floored by the fact that this man was a philosopher, PhD, educated from Germany, who could actually, he said, was the first person who could go toe to toe with him. Now, at the beginning, he didn't know he was a Christian. He had made his, he and his friends had fun just mocking and ridiculing Christians. And then he meets this guy, and he all of a sudden had complete respect for him and asked him if they could meet weekly to, discuss philosophy. Well, this man was incredibly patient and helped him over time see, gave him relational patience, gave him respect, and talked with him and discussed with him philosophy on his level, to where at the end of the day, after several months, he was able to see that his own philosophy was empty and vacuous, and that he was willing at that point to see what else, was out there. And he came to know that this man was a Christian, and at that point he wanted to turn and disprove Christianity, right? So, but what it did was it opened him to the possibility of pursuing. And it gave him an example of someone who was an embodied intellectual who actually took ideas seriously. Now, again, that's more a rational disruptive witness. And it started Davin on a journey, not only that was rational. Once he was convinced intellectually, he had an experience with God and anyway became a strong apologist, both for the mind and heart. I think another disruptive witness on a very different way would be if someone, say, embraced a more emotional type of atheism, that they had been hurt in their life. They had maybe tragedy. Perhaps they had a really tragic upbringing, maybe an alcoholic parent, or they just couldn't see how there could be a good and loving God in light of their circumstance, in light of their tragedy or events. That's just not even conceivable to them. There was a young boy named Mike who believed that Jesus loved him, and then he lost his brothers in a house fire suddenly at age 7, and he went from there hating God with a vengeance. He wouldn't have anything to do with Christianity. He wouldn't go into a church for a wedding or a funeral. He had such vitriol against everything religious So he developed quite a strong rational arsenal against Christianity as well to defend his internal pain and hatred, essentially. 20 years later, however, his wife became a Christian while he was on a business trip, and he came back, and that just fueled his rage. He went to go pick her up at the home of the couple that had brought her to Christ. He was expecting a real verbal battle, I guess. He was angry. He couldn't imagine, anyone good sitting on the other side of this argument. And he went in, and he had become a bit of a hardened individual, very difficult to approach, I think, because they invited him in, he was English, for a cup of tea, and it disarmed him. They were warm. They were hospitable. He sat down. He said, they treated me like I was a human. They valued him. They listened to him. They didn't talk about God or faith or religion. They just valued him. And he couldn't believe it. It was something that he had not experienced in his life, to be honest.
Wow.
And so he was attracted to that. He kept coming back and back and back. And they learned his story, and he asked his questions. And it took a long time for him to start asking questions about God. They never pushed or forced or pressed. But that, and now he's he's a pastor of a church in England. He goes around listening to stories, binding wounds, emotional wounds, listening. But he also has answers. They had answers for him too when he became ready to ask the bigger questions about God. But it took a very long time, and an intentional investment, love. It was a very disruptive witness to him. It was very disarming.
Jana, the first story you were sharing is something I feel like I've kind of intuited in talking to many skeptics, is that until you realize that your current home is unsatisfactory to live in, you don't go shopping for another home. But it feels extremely rude to walk into someone's home and point out how bad the wallpaper is and how low the ceilings are and how the furniture is not that comfortable. I mean, that just feels very inappropriate to do to someone when that's the house they live in.
Right.
But until someone realizes that the way they're living, the way they're experiencing reality isn't satisfactory, they may not go looking for another house. But the second story you shared had a twist. If you see your dream home, all of a sudden you realize that's where I want to live. And when this person experienced the relational, spiritual quality of love in that couple's home, he realized that was the dream home he wanted. And it took him some time to test and find out, does this dream home exist? Would it be credible for me to live there? Can I afford it? All the questions you ask. But once he realized this house is real and I can live there, he wanted it. And so that was just my kind of picking up that sometimes we have to help them realize this doesn't work, but it's very powerful to show them there's another way.
I think that's a beautiful it's a beautiful analogy. Os Guinness says it this way, that someone will not be open to another worldview until they become dissatisfied with their own. And I think you're right in that sometimes we're quick to say, here's what's wrong with your house, before they actually realize it themselves. They're very comfortable in their house. They don't feel like they need to change the furniture or move, and as a very visual person, and I'm an artist, so it's easy for me to see when things are a little bit askew in someone's home. But yet I know relationally that doesn't do any good for me to go in and just start moving things around. And your point is very well taken. And I think there's a lot to be said and for self-discovery through not even just showing someone what it could be, but also helping and guide them through where things may not be quite as good as they think they are in their own home. through help and guide them rather than tell them is a wiser way to go.
Now, we still have the disruptive crisis and the disruptive circumstance. So what are those two
Yes.
about?
Yes. Disruptive. Well, let me just say real quickly, disruptive longings. The difference there is that someone may come to that point on their own. They may be in their house for a while, and then they start seeing, hey, I need to paint my walls again. Maybe this life that I've chosen isn't working as well for me as I thought. There was a young man who was the anti-theist. He had bought into Dan Barker's, against religion, reason against religion, or whatever it is. He just loved the intellectual banter against Christians and putting everybody down. He loved writing his own moral blank check to live his life the way that he wanted. And he thought in his 30s, he might even just end his life if there's really no meaning or purpose. But he got to his 30s and he actually started with some existential angst, I guess you could say. He started realizing, is this what life is all about? Do I just go to my work day after day? It feels like I'm building a sandcastle on the sand for the water and the waves just to wash it away. What is this all about? So that was a real gradual time of him self-reflecting that there has to be something more than this. And that was the catalyst for him. Even the podcast that I just released on Friday, intelligent man, brilliant man, highly educated man, but the driver for him was this sense of meaninglessness. It can be a very strong and compelling thing, but it is something that usually they come to on their own. Or it could be a sense of longing to make sense of your world. Like Jordan Monget, who strong again anti-theist. She had been brought up with a father who was a philosopher. She was a critical thinker. At age 7, she called into a radio show and said, I don't think I should be compelled to say this Pledge of Allegiance under God, in the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, she was that strong, but she was also a critical thinker, and she had to make sense of her reality. The one thing that bothered her was she was a very moral person. She could not ground her own morality. When she got to Harvard, that was the thing, that longing in her to make sense of her world intellectually and into existentially there, that led her to become open towards discussion. And she met an intelligent young man there who helped guide her to make sense of, if there's an objective reality, then there has to be an objective moral lawgiver and all of that. So a longing, makes a difference.
And I think sometimes in terms of guiding, if there is trust and if there is kindness and if there is an openness to the conversation on both parties, that when I've noticed a skeptic confess to me, I don't think there's any meaning to life, to say, okay, I'm interested in that. Tell me more about that conviction, and allow them to experience what that means in more and more areas of their lives. And so I remember walking with a skeptic outside of Harvard. I did campus ministry there for a few years. And it was one of those glorious spring days you've been waiting for all through the cold Boston winter. And finally, there is happiness outside, and there are flowers and birds are chirping. It's just one of those days where everyone is outside and everyone is happy. And I turned to my friend and I said, this is the most meaningless thing ever, isn't it? And he just looked crushed to finally have this day full of hope and joy and happiness and beauty, and to be reminded that by his own lights, this was completely meaningless. It was unbearable. And so it was little things like that. I wasn't trying to hurt him or ruin the spring day. He knew I loved him, and he knew that was a prompting to consider, does this longing for meaning have more weight to you than this more flimsy intellectual conviction that nothing can have meaning? And so I think there is a way in these relationships to clarify what someone wants, that they want meaning, they want beauty, they want love, they want a grounding for morality, but their mind isn't letting them access that part of reality. And that can be part of helping them see the disruptive longing for what it is.
I think, yes, that's very powerful. I think sometimes we dismiss that we're different people, but we're the same. I mean, we're in our humanity. We all want very similar things. We want to be known and loved. We want to have meaning and purpose and value. We want our lives to count for something. You know, there's all these things in our humanity that draw us together. And like you say, Carson, we can communicate on those things. Even if, for example, we can't particularly meet each other, perhaps on certain intellectual things, or they may have a strong bias one way or another, we can connect in our humanity and look at, you know, the value of life is only found in a God-centered worldview, you know. And so, like you say, we can be gentle and raise questions like that, because those are questions common to us all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The disruptive crisis is something very similar in that it's accelerated, right? Because something comes from the outside, a trauma, an event, and you're unprepared. It could be, you know, a cancer diagnosis. It could be, you know, someone's sudden death. It could be anything that's creating a crisis point in someone's life. And so they're willing, whereas they weren't willing before, they are suddenly willing to be engaged in the bigger questions of life. I think one thing important here to say is capitalizing on what you were talking about is relationship. Being in relationship with someone so that when crisis events come in someone's life, you are there and they look to you. It's interesting because crisis, as you know, can push someone away from God just as much as it can open someone towards God. There's a story, one of the people in my study also on the podcast, Brandon McConnell, had both. He completely was at war with God because he prayed that his father wouldn't die after a massive heart attack, and they ended up pulling life support 3 days later. And he said he was on the war path, you know, against God. He would take the Bible in the bookstore and put it in the fiction section. I mean, he was just, you know, he wanted nothing to do with God. He said he was extremely prideful during that period of time, but he had a crisis in his life. He was training to be an air traffic controller. He had a sudden, unexpected visual cut or visual loss in his peripheral vision. Well, it's hard to be an air traffic controller when your vision is coming and going. They couldn't find anything. You know, they hospitalized him, did all kinds of tests. It finally resolved with no real answer. It happened again. He had to quit his job, move home, which, you know, you don't want to do in your mid-20s.
No.
But what he said it did for him was it humbled him. And his mom came in and told him the story. He said she wasn't a real religious person. She wasn't very articulate. He said, but she came in and she told me the story of Paul, who was persecuting Christians, and he was kind of on his high horse, and he was blinded. And he was willing to see God for the first time. And he said she left the room, and I went and found the Bible that I knew I had in my room somewhere from, you know, his grandmother years ago. And he became open. So he had a crisis that pushed him away, and then he had a crisis that actually brought him forward. Or like another woman, Nikki, Jewish atheist, Portland, Oregon, very kind of godless world there, intellectual, loved ideas. She became sick, terminally sick, and was hospitalized. And the only person who came and ministered to her was a Christian woman she had met in AA. That was life-changing for her because she said, I needed to be loved. And someone loved me. It, you know, again, that on its own at the beginning does not convince someone that it's true. What it does is it opens the door to see whether or not it's true. And she was led she actually had an encounter with Christ as well in that journey. But yes, it's the crisis produces openness, and that's not surprising,
Right. I think that in particular can encourage Christians who have gifts of mercy and service, who are very empathetic, the counselors among the body of Christ, that those gifts that God has equipped them with, the mom who's willing to open up her home to her son who's lost work because he's gotten a partial blindness, or someone who's in the hospital, and you're willing to go and make that a commitment and provide care and be a loving presence in their hospital room. Those are gifts that meet someone's needs, and that in itself is beautiful, whatever comes of it, just to love them in that way. But perhaps if they were to hear this conversation, Jana, they could have that spirit-led openness to how, in a non-manipulative, non-quid pro quo way, but just in an overflow of love for that person, that ministry of service and care could also prompt some conversations about Jesus.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I heard another person say, he had been in an accident, was and broken his neck in the hospital, and a nurse prayed for him, read the Bible to him, even though he would have nothing to do with it. He said, I could tell that there was something very kind about her. And he said, that was the first night that I prayed.
Okay.
So you just never know. Even a small action with someone you don't know very well can make a tremendous difference, that someone can feel a touch of God.
So what's the disruptive circumstance?
Yeah. The disruptive circumstance is not where someone kind of comes in from the outside that you don't know, who kind of dismantles your stereotypes. It's someone you know. And someone actually becomes a Christian, and it becomes very off-putting. It could be a wife, a spouse. It could become a girlfriend. It can be a grandparent. And so that it's suddenly something that was distant becomes very up close and personal, and it's affecting your life. Daniel Roger is the one with the grandparents. He's this young British guy, he doesn't care a flip about God or religion. It's just, something he has, it's just not in his world. It's just not even worth consideration. And then his grandparents become Christians and start to try to talk to him about it. And it really, he says, I thought they were mental, and I didn't want anything. My life was going fine, but they kept talking about it, and it just drove me crazy. So he said, I need to figure this out. And he said, I was not an intellectual kind of guy. He wasn't a books oriented person. He said, but I need to figure this out. And so he actually went to go disprove it. And of course, now he holds his master's degree in philosophy, and he contends for, the bioethics from a Christian point of view. So his life is completely transformed by the fact that his grandparents had become Christians, and it just it interrupted his world. So it's one of those things. Peter Byram's also an interesting story. All of these are on podcasts, but he left his Christian faith behind. It was not convenient at college, right? He had a nominal kind of Christianity. Went to college. He had some sincere doubts, he said, about Christianity, but he also had some insincere motives. But his circumstance is that he actually lived with two guys, one who was a Christian who also became an atheist, just like he did. And he also had an atheist who had become a Christian. So they had these, university is the time of discussing ideas. So he was thrown in the middle of these, ongoing discussions about what is true and what is real. And he was kind of compelled to figure out the truth. He'd been reading The New Atheist, heard Richard Dawkins say, follow the evidence wherever it leads. And so he followed the evidence where it led. It just didn't lead to atheism. It led to a profoundly intellectually grounded belief in God. So, it's interesting how, your circumstances it comes in your world, and you have to deal with it. And that's what can happen.
So, Jana, one of the threads I hear throughout your research is the way in which God activates his people to bear witness to who he is. And some of the concepts we've talked about are the character traits of humility, listening, hospitality, asking questions, kindness, acts of service, just a gentleness and availability, and a respect for the skeptical friend, relational equity and trust. So I don't want to take your whole answer, but what does it look like for a Christian to be a disruptive witness or to be part of the disruptive circumstances? Can you flesh out what you've learned about what kind of Christian witness is often correlated with God reaching into someone's life and bringing them to Jesus?
You really summarized that very well, Carson. But I'm with you. I think one of the most striking findings in my study was that when I looked at the journey of these 50 former atheists and their journeying to Christ, 80% of them had a Christian intersect their life. So I would say that the most important thing is to be present in someone's life. No matter how wonderful a Christian you are, if you're not intersecting with people who don't believe, they probably, won't see the beautiful, embodied, meaningful, satisfied, available, respectful, joy-filled, satisfied life. It has to. I love what Michael Ramsden said one time. We're called to be salt and light. Salt, it doesn't do much good when it's sitting on the table. It actually has to make contact with the food in order to be savoring, right? To be preserving, to be all of those things that salt does. So we have to get in the mix in a sense. We have to go against the grain of social distancing, not from a COVID perspective, but from a relational perspective. We have to be in places and with people and making friends and building relationships with people who don't believe the way that we do, so that they can see an embodied Christ in a way that they never thought possible. So I would say that, but it also comes with that is, I love the way that Jeff Dogman says, he says, the city on the hill is an analogy that works both ways. So that if you are going to be in relationship and be in close contact with people, you have to live an authentic Christ-centered life. Nearly half of the people say they rejected Christianity and God because of the appearance of hypocrisy, what they'd seen, what they experienced, what they heard. And so we need to be those who actually, and I've heard this from several when they talk about how to engage non-believers, one of the most important things is that we need to make sure that we're engaged with the Lord ourselves, so that how we engage with others is very reflective of the fact that we have a transformed life. That if God and Christianity is meant to demonstrate that God transforms you in a way that's supernatural and amazing, and gives you an abundant life, a life in Christ, and what that looks like, then we should be living palpably different. If we're not living a transformed life, they would think, they say, we have nothing to offer. If we live no differently from the world, if we live no differently from anybody else in the neighborhood, then why? Why?
Yeah, I
So,
once had a pastor say that he attempted to blend right into his neighborhood and act like all of his other neighbors so they wouldn't think he was weird for being a pastor. And I didn't feel comfortable. Maybe I should have exercised more courage to challenge him, but I found it so perplexing that he wanted to look like all the other neighbors instead of embracing the weirdness of being a pastor and not to be crazy, but to demonstrate something of Jesus to his neighbors. And, that was part of, you brought up someone from the former RZIM. That was part of why I felt a public critique of what was happening there was so necessary, to contrast, the truth-telling vulnerability we're called to as Christians with how that situation was handled. And so, how we embrace this is so difficult and so challenging, but finding, because what I find in my life, Jana, is as soon as I'm acting like salt and light, I realize I'm pretty proud of how well I'm being salt and light. And that seems to undercut the whole power of being salt and light. And so I have to again confess that, to people, and attempt again to embrace the way of Jesus, in my relationships. And so these
Yeah,
are
I think,
very hard things to do.
yeah, I think humility is an extremely difficult thing. But there's one woman, in fact, her podcast is coming up very soon, and a very bright PhD biologist professor. And the only reason she engaged with someone that she saw, there was an opinion article in the paper about science and faith, and the only reason she said she engaged with him was because of his kindness and the way that people were attacking him, but also his humility. Once she actually started meeting with him to talk about substantial issues,
Wow.
but she said, even I would not have learned from him had he not been humble enough to learn from me as well. So there has to be a humility. We can't just approach people like we have all of the answers. There's got to be, even though, Jesus is such a beautiful picture, but it's a humility with grace, but also it's a humility with resolve. And that is, it's a humility without compromise of your faith, but it's a humility in terms of just approaching the person and valuing them and valuing their perspective and those kinds of things. It's, that's incredibly important. I think humility.
Yeah, and I think that to the degree I've been part of training programs for evangelism that have had an undertone of, here's the answers, here's the enemy, and here's how you're going to invade and destroy them. That kind of mentality to evangelism is something I've had to work against and say that's not at all how I want to engage with someone made in God's image. And I have so much to learn from them. Often the way they've critiqued Christian practice has led me to realize an area where I need repentance and faith and new life in Christ. I mean, I can learn about following Jesus from the critique of a skeptic as much as from a sermon on Sunday morning. And there's other things they can teach me too. Jesus needed water, and there was a woman who was able to slake his thirst. So there's a lot of ways in which we are needy and vulnerable creatures, and to miss out on a real relationship and a genuine friendship seems like an impoverished way of engaging with God's creatures.
And
Jana, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just real quick, if I could add on to that, I think that doing the hard work of preparation and knowing how and why your own worldview is true gives you confidence in
Yes.
it, so that you don't have to approach somebody with a hammer and they're a nail, like you were saying before.
Right.
You can say, let's look at this together, because you're convinced you know what is true, and truth does not fear questions, right? And so we don't have to have a defensive posture or just a preachy posture or anything. We can look at this together. But doing the hard work of preparation when those questions come, also, that's something that we have to do. That's part of our calling. We're mandated to do that, but it's all together. It's all together. I love the way that Peter says that, you set your hearts apart for Christ. So, you have the humility, and he is God and we're not. And and we appreciate people and value others, but we're also called to give reason for that hope, for why we believe and what we believe. And so, it all works together, you know.
There's a substance there. There's a substance of intellectual engagement, loving
Right,
God with our minds, but we're also
right.
loving God with our hearts. We're also loving our neighbor. It's loving God in all the ways He's called us to love.
Yes.
And, yeah. So, Jana, you mentioned that these are catalysts, but they're not the whole process. And
Right.
actually, someone who's participating asked us this. They said, are there specific steps or stages in the process of someone moving from skepticism to faith? Did you know
Yeah.
of any, or is it more just like a zigzaggy road? I mean, how does it work out that someone has this catalytic experience and ends up following Jesus?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Again, I would say when I looked at the process, it's mostly, there's the atheist at holding on to belief. There's the catalyst that opens someone towards another perspective. Then there's what I call the quest stage.
Okay.
Because as I said earlier, someone may go along with, okay, I want to have meaning in my life, but is it true? Well, I love the way that you're such a nice person and kind, and I would love to be that way, or I would love to have stability here or there. But is it true? Most people have to go down that path of believing whether or not it's true. And so now the folks that I tend to engage with, the atheists and the skeptics, they really are more bent towards, let me figure this out. They don't want to just take it for granted. They're not just going to accept your word for it. There's too great of social loss. There's too great of loss of autonomy. The changing of a worldview is changing your whole world. So a lot of times it's a process of, okay, well, let me sit in church for a little while. If they have a believing spouse, or, okay, let me just read a little bit of the Bible. Okay, well, what about this book? Or I might listen to this podcast. Some of it is if they're very, like 20% of those who came to faith, it was a very independent journey. They didn't talk with anybody. They started pursuing, podcast debates, reading books on their own. They really had to wrestle with things on their own. Some people actually progressed with, another Christian or someone else that they were engaging with, but half of them didn't even step foot into a church until, they became a Christian. They believed before they belonged.
Okay.
Some will belong before they believe. Some have an immediate kind of, well, I've had a few who've had spiritual experiences of dreams and visions, or sometimes in desperation, in a desperate moment, they'll call out for God and God shows up, whether it's an answered prayer in some extraordinary way, or like I say, or a dream or a vision or encounter with Christ that they weren't not expecting. Every journey is different, but there's usually a questing and a process of some sort of becoming open. Okay, sometimes I'm open, but anything but Jesus. I'm ready to move away from atheism or naturalism or materialism. It's not giving me everything. But like Ashley Land, for example, she said, well, maybe I need something more than just what nihilism offers me. I'll try psychedelics.
Right.
She tried that world for a while. Then she's like, but I'm still missing something. There's still meaninglessness. So she saw a Christian friend who handled a daughter's death in an extraordinary way. And she's like, what do you have? So, and then she went on as a reader, as an intellect, again, to pursue it intellectually. So it's usually a process that depends on the person, whether they're engaged with Christians or not in their community, whether they're willing to even engage with other people. But I would say, for the most part, something attractive about the faith opens them to the possibility, about 82%, but they would not believe 99% would not believe unless they believed it was grounded in truth and reality. So there was a strong intellectual, so they ended up believing for intellectual and existential reasons, essentially. But it's usually something attractive that opened the door, but it had to be something substantive for belief itself.
That's amazing that in your research, 99% had an intellectual part that came into the process at some
Yes.
point.
Yes.
Is there a reason why you think that? Is that selection bias, Jana? That's just the kind of people you find, or do you think, hey, I've looked every which way, and this is a common theme, and here's why that is so important? What explains that?
Well, again, I think from an atheistic point of view, there's such a strong stereotyping against Christianity and belief in God, that to make that kind of a dramatic turn and to lose or to leave your world, your life behind, and to submit to an authority above you, you have to know that it's true. I mean, in the academic world, nearly all of the social sciences, the humanities, believe that religion is nothing but something that solves a functional problem. It gives you social belonging. It's a psychological crutch. There's no ontological essence to God. There's nothing supernatural at all. It does not exist. It's a figment of your imagination. So those are a lot of biases to overcome, that it's anti-scientific, that it's all of these things. And so these are problems and pieces that have to be resolved. When you've lived in that resistant world for a long time, you have to know that it makes sense. And it makes sense intellectually as well as existentially. So maybe it was, the particular population that I was with. But like I say, some of them were not particularly intellectually grounded people, but over time they had to know. There was one woman who was like, we moved to a new community. My boys wanted to go to church. I went to church. I believed in Jesus and yada, 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 So it was like, it was like the thing to do. She was that outlier, but everybody else really had to know substantively, give me good reasons why this is true, because I'm giving my life to it.
Now, Jana, one other person had this question for you. In your research, how do skeptics begin their Christian life? Is it still full of tentativeness and a questioning, or by the time they become a Christian, they're ready to go, they're confident and committed to the way of Jesus?
I think that speaks to how we all are as Christians. Mm-hmm. Some of us are more skeptical by nature. Some embrace things without a doubt. I know Jesus, I'm certain 100%, in our world, Carson, we don't use certainty. We don't use the terms of 100% and certainty.
Right.
There's always room for doubt. And some people put today, in fact, again, Dawn, who upcoming podcast, she would say, I'm still a skeptic. I can't help it. It's who I am. I will always and forever be skeptical. It's my nature. And a lot of these people are very skeptical by nature. And so while they believe, they've been convinced, some of them, like the young man, let me just say this, like the young man who was very brilliant, met the intellectual philosopher, and he's like, okay, he went through an 18-month process of studying, worldview, philosophers, apologetics, everything. Right. Came to the end of 18 months and says, okay, I believe it intellectually, but I know that there's something more, right? If there's a real God that exists, I have to know and believe it more than intellectually. And we all do, because we're giving our life to a person.
Yes.
A person who is truth, not just proposition, a propositional belief. And so he actually said, I'm going to try this out. And so he went to church and he prayed, and he said he wanted to experience God, and God gave him an experience. So he became, he had this vision that was just very compelling. But it was again, it depends on different people, how settled they are intellectually in it, existentially, emotionally, socially. There's all these components that play in our lives. But I can tell you without a doubt, I can't say with most confidence, that the 50 former atheists that I have engaged, as well as those beyond in my podcasting, are the most extraordinary Christ followers. They want everyone to know and believe in Christ, in Jesus, and that God exists and he makes a difference for your life and that he is really there and it's worth believing. And here's why. I've never seen a more compelling group of inspired, on fire Christians in my life. I think it's because they understand and they know palpably what it feels like to live in darkness. And then they're given a life that is so extraordinary and beyond what they experienced and knew before, that they are extremely strong ambassadors for Christ. Many of them have gone to advanced degrees. Many of them have gone on to be in ministry. It's because of the life change they've experienced and the truth that they have discovered, and they contend for it. But yeah, it's different, just like for Christians. But in terms of a normal path, some just kind of drift in, and not drift. That's the wrong word. They accept it, and they accept it strongly and compellingly. Yeah.
Now,
But
Jana,
almost above the average Christian, those of us who've been raised with it all of our lives, somehow I look at these former skeptics and go, wow, I wish we had the passion, and the boldness and the courage and the intention that these people have, because it's extraordinary.
wow. Now, Jana, you've mentioned their stories all the way through, which I've been really happy about. But the Side B podcast, you started this and you host it and you engage with people who have gone through this journey. What's the motivation behind this podcast? This will be our last question, but I just want you to tell us about the Side B podcast and what you hope your listeners will gain from listening to it.
Thank you for asking, Carson. Yes, I think my heart, as is yours, is evangelical in nature, evangelistic in nature. I want people to experience and know God in the way that I do, and I'm sure you do in the way that you do. That's probably why you're hosting this. So in a way, I want curious skeptics, those who are actually interested in the question of God, how to have a place where they can come and hear people who were like them, who are smart, who are sharp, who had all kinds of experiences in their lives and all kinds of reasons for rejecting God, that they can actually see that there's a pathway to belief, and that these are real people for real stories. And it's not only for the curious skeptic, but it's also for Christians who actually have someone they know, they love, they want to engage with non-believers, that a way for them to understand the skeptic, how to better engage with the skeptic. One thing I love about the podcast, at the very end, I always ask them, I say, how would you encourage the skeptic who's skeptical, who is interested, and they give their advice. And then I say, how would you, as a former atheist who's now a Christian, how would you encourage Christians how to believe with non-believers, how to engage with non-believers? And so they give their wisdom, they give their advice. So I think it's for the skeptic. It's also for the Christian. And if I can just say one more thing, and that is that we've had great response from the podcast. There's around the world people who are listening and learning and hopefully being encouraged and inspired and finding hope. But we're actually launching our new website with short video testimonies. It also houses all of the podcasts and resources from people, like all of the books and resources that people have recommended that they used or that helped them through their journey. And so we're hoping that will be an incredible resource for everyone who's also interested in the podcast. So for atheists and Christians around the world.
What a great gift that is to anyone who has that concern. Well, Jana, you have shared with us a lot of wonderful stories and some very specific insights, and you've done it with such a kind heart. And so it has been a joy to learn from you today, and I'm excited for how this conversation will help a lot of other people. I'm going to put a link to your show and your Twitter account, Jana Harmon Side B, is on Twitter, and so people can follow you there and make sure they're following you to get these updates as they come out. If you've managed to listen this far, I would love to invite you to be part of the Uncommon Pursuit community. We are going to be able to debrief this episode and further explore our questions and help one another out from brothers and sisters in Christ all around the world, different generations and ages, helping one another engage with this material and put it into practice. So if you want to be part of a community that will take you from kind of a passive consumption of information into an active practicing of it so that you're well prepared to engage the skeptics in your context, we would love for you to join the Uncommon Pursuit community. So go to uncommonpursuit.net and check it out. Well, Jana, again, I just want to say thank you for coming on the program today and giving us of your time. And I hope people will listen to the Side B podcast and allow that to be an encouragement for their posture and their preparedness to proclaim the gospel and show the way of Jesus and invite people into his life and into his light. To everyone who's watching, thank you. There's a lot of videos on YouTube. There's a lot of ways you could have spent your time today. Thank you for giving us a listen, and we hope you'll sign up for a future event with us or subscribe to the Side B podcast. Have a great day.